G'day everybody, today I am working on the Landcruiser. It's over there behind me, you can probably see it. We are fitting a second EGT temp gauge. Yeah, if you've been following along the channel for probably 3 years ago now almost, well maybe not quite 3 years ago, but since basically the start of the channel, you'll remember that I rebuilt the engine in the Landcruiser and I put a exhaust temp gauge in there. If you're really paying attention, you'll remember I spoke about where the position of that gauge was mounted, the center part of it anyway. And now I'm actually going to set up that second one that I spoke about doing years ago. So I've got myself another gauge, just a cheap one. I wasn't going to waste 400 bucks on a red arc one because this one isn't going to be as important. But I'll basically explain, this video will be just an installation video. I'll try and make it pretty quick and simple. I'm not going to get too in depth, it's just going to be basics of like where you're running your wires and where you're mounting it. So I'll sort of just have a chat about that, and then we'll do a second video on the reasons I put this second gauge in, the differences that it's going to show, and yeah, it'll just be a little bit of a educational video I guess. But yeah, I'll do that, that'll be a later video. So I got my gauge, got some wires, a couple of fuses. The brand of the gauge is Bezel or Bezel. I've never heard of them. It's just a cheap eBay one. I think it was like 60 bucks. I'm not expecting big things from it. So yeah, anyway, that doesn't matter. Then I got all the wiring here. There's a few wires here. These are for an extra gauge if you want to join it up. Power wires. This is to hook up into the back of your gauge that runs off your temp sensor. So this is the little probe unit. And this button, this one here, is just to change the modes on the gauge screen, which is pretty much the same as what red arc run. It's very similar to a red arc thing, so it's obviously just a cheap Chinese knockoff. Yeah, a couple of fuse holders. It says in the manual, in the instructions, to use a 0.3 amp fuse. I couldn't find any, so I'm just using 3 amp. Now I know it's probably not, even though the instructions say to do that, it's probably no good to be using a 3 amp, but I'm not too concerned. Yeah, 3 amp will blow pretty easy. So those 0.3 amp fuses are a fast blow fuse, and I'm not really too concerned about it. If the gauge gets wrecked, which is unlikely it'll happen, but if it does, it's only 60 bucks, I'm not too worried. And all this stuff's interchangeable between gauges, I reckon, so that won't be a drama. Then I've just got some wire, just to lengthen these wires over here so they can fit in the ute. Then here's the instructions. It's got a heap of different instructions for different applications. So obviously we're doing the temp sensor one, so it shows the probe in the manifold, which is where my red arc one is. It's in the manifold as well. There's one for an oil sensor, coolant, and then here's just the basics of how to wire in the gauge. But yeah, it's just a bit of other rubbish on the back. And a few more explanations. You're putting it into a fuel rail. What's that? Boost. And that might be, oh, it's for a tacho, if you want to put a tacho in. And then yeah, there's all like the settings you can go through with your the button, which all changes all different readings on the gauge. Also comes with inbuilt warnings, so you can set a warning temperature. That's the same as red arc, and a lot of other gauges do the same thing. And I'm not saying this gauge is the go out and buy it, it's so great. Just telling you about the gauge. If you want one, I can try and put a link in the description if I can find it again. But as I said, she's just a cheap eBay one. Alright, so I'll show you sort of what my plans are on the ute. I'll show you where the temp sensor probe is gonna go. And I'm just gonna mount this next to me red arc gauge. It won't look pretty or anything, I don't really care either. Yeah, I'm not really one for, you know, molding it into the trim or anything like that. Maybe one day if I get real excited, I'll build a little cubby hole for it. But I'm pretty rough and ready to go with these sort of things. So it ain't worrying me. Alright, so we're just over here at the ute. So we are looking into what the mess is at the moment. You can see my terrible plumbed up engine breather filter, which I'm going to get rid of and get an actual decent one. That thing is just a cheap eBay one and it's crap. It does bugger all. It's just taking up space and making a mess. I still need to get this ute tuned. I've been saying it for like the last 2 years that I'm going to get it tuned. I still haven't. It's putting out so much PSI at the moment. It's putting out about 15 pound, I think, and it's blowing oil out of the manifold, inlet manifold, and it's, yeah, covered inside of my engine in oil. So I've still got to get that gearbox, and once I get that gearbox that I've spoken about previously, then I'll get it tuned. So yeah, harp at me in the comments, and maybe it'll make me do it faster. You'll see where the red tag is. That's the probe into the manifold for the red arc gauge. So that's the original one I put in. If you remember, when I built the engine, John at North Geelong Engines, he said, put the gauge, you're better off putting the probe in the manifold than in the turbo, behind the turbo. And I explained a little bit about it in that video. If you want to jump back and try and find that video, be my guest, but I'll talk about it in the next one, which will be what that video is about. Now, it's probably going to be harder to see, but down on the bottom of the turbo, I'll try and point to it, just there, is the original probe for the original gauge that used to be in the ute. So when I bought the ute, it came with a gauge. It didn't work, it was broken, but that's where the original probe was mounted. So that's got like the thread already welded in and the old probe's still in it, just blocking the hole. So I'm going to undo that, throw that out, and that's where the new one's going to go. So then we'll effectively have a temp gauge reading from the manifold temperature, then we'll have one reading after turbo, and that should give us, there'll be a difference, and it'll be quite, hopefully it's going to be quite surprising to some people what that difference is. It's not necessary to have two. I'm just doing it because I've got that little port that I can hook up to, and I thought it'd be an interesting video to make. But it will show the temperature of the turbo, and if something odd happens there, then I'll be able to tell there's a problem with the turbo if the temperature isn't rising at that manifold sensor. So here's my red arc gauge just sitting up here. That's doing a pretty good job. It works pretty well. So I'm just going to put the new one just next to it. I'll mount it and cut a couple of holes through the dash cover, and we'll mount it up sort of half all right. As you can tell, the wires just run straight out of there, and that's how I've left it, and it doesn't worry me. I might tidy it up a little bit, put a few zip ties around them, but I don't really care. So I'll talk about where I'm going to wire this into. I won't show you me doing all the wires. I'll just sort of tell you, give you a quick glimpse and move on. I don't want this video to drag on forever. But basically, I do quite a bit of wiring at work. We do accessories on brand new trucks and all that sort of stuff, which I don't enjoy doing, but I do quite a bit of it. Anyway, so what I find is the easiest way to go about mounting new accessories and electrical devices into your car, truck, tractor, whatever you're working on. Work out where you want to run your wiring first before you get in and start pulling stuff apart and running wires just into the dash. It can become a headache if you're trying to find wiring and you're stuffing around with a test light trying to find out ignition or battery or what's this and what's that. So plan it out first, so I know exactly where I'm running the wires. It's going to be basically the same as where the red arc runs off, because it's basically the same system, except it doesn't have the little computer module for the boost control. So I'm going to run the battery wire, which takes main battery power down here off that red wire just there, which hooks up on the back of the fuse. I'll fuse it off that. That's got battery power, and I sort of like keeping my fuses in the fuse panel. Well, not in the fuse panel, but the same area, so I can just look easily and find them. And that's a handy tip, is if you can get your fuse wires, or like main power wires, to your fuse box and fuse them there, that'll save you headaches if you ever pop that fuse, and you won't have to look far to find them. It'll just be under your fuse box cover. And then I'm going to take the ignition wire straight off the cigarette lighter. So the old cigarette lighter is probably the most common place for getting ignition power. That's generally your first go-to for most people that are running new accessories. And then the third wire, which will be related to power, is going to be for lighting. I'm pretty sure there was one on there. If I'm wrong, I will correct myself, but I'm pretty sure there was a wire that went, so you would hook it on to say your park light. So when you turn your parkers on or your lights, the gauge will illuminate at night, which it should illuminate anyway. It's a digital gauge, but it'll be brighter. I'm going to do the same thing I did on the Red Arc. I'm going to run it off the back of the dimmer switch. So when you turn your dash lights down, I'm going to set it off that so I can dim the gauge as well. I did the same thing with the Red Arc and it works really good. I don't generally dim it because the dash lights in the Landcruisers are so poor that if I dim it, the dash lights go off before that thing dims right down. It's not a drama. But if I ever did need to dim it for whatever reason, that's what I'll be doing. So I'll pull some of this dash section apart, expose my wires, quickly test them to make sure that I'm right where I'm hooking them up, and then I'll start wiring stuff up and we'll go from there. Rightio, I took the air pipe off from the filter to that pipe there. It goes to my second snorkel so I can run the probe. So as you can see, that's in there now. That just runs up with the second EGT probe, runs into my wiring here, which is, you know, a little bit messy, but whatever. Then runs down into the firewall. So now that's set up, yeah, that's all good. So I can put the pipes back on and then I'll start wiring up in the cab. And yeah, we'll run some electrical wires then. So I'll be back with you in a second. All right, here's the wire for the that goes to the probe. So that's run from the turbo, or the exhaust off the turbo, up in through the firewall, up in the dash, up into my spaghetti. So now I am working on, so here's the main loom, or wires, that plug into the back, red, white, yellow and black. I'll just have to go off my paperwork what one's what. So white is ignition, red is battery, yellow is to your lights, and black is obviously earth. So what I'm going to do is, it's only this long, so it's not very long, so I'm going to extend it. I've got some extra wire here. So what I'm going to work on first is the ignition and light side. So everything that needs to run over into there. I've remembered where my light wire goes into. So this is the back of the dimmer switch for the dash. And there's the wire that runs up to the Red Arc gauge. So I'm going to solder it in the same spot as well. Also, I found this plug that went to nothing that had an ignition wire power when the ignition was on. So I'm just going to put a spade terminal into this, and that will run the ignition part of the wiring. That's another handy tip to look out for when you're wiring up stuff, is blank plugs that go to nothing. They're always good spots to do wiring from, whether it be battery or ignition. That one has battery and ignition. So keep your eyes peeled for that sort of thing. It'll make your life a little bit easier, and you're not having to splice into wires and yeah, using electrical tape and whatnot, and it sort of keeps it a little bit neater too. So I'll extend these couple of wires, and then I'll extend all of them actually, and then I'll come back to you once I've done that, and then I'll start running wires up through the dash, and we'll start joining them up and putting fuses in and soldering and all that good stuff. Okay, as you can see, I just soldered all my wires together and put some heat shrink on them. I'll wrap some tape around along this as well, just a bit of extra protection. And then once I've done that, I'll run that up under here, under the dash, and up into, just up out here, next to all these wires. And then I'll route all those wires, well, 2 over to there, the power wire down to that fuse I spoke about. There's also an earth point up there. So when I've sort of routed them and I've got that set up, I'll come back to you and I'll show you what I'm doing then. Alright, I've just spent a few minutes running the ignition wire and the wire that will light up the gauge. Well, won't light up the gauge, but it'll come on when the lights come on. So I'll show you what I've done there. It's pretty simple, and it's going to work pretty well. So the yellow wire goes to the dimmer switch, which is there, and I've just twisted it around where I've soldered that other wire on for the Red Arc gauge. And then the green wire is for the ignition, which is going to plug into the back of this plug on the grey wire, which is just there. So I'll run that in behind the dash and click that in, and then I'll drop a bit of solder on that, and yeah, she should be right to go. And we can put all the dash back together, and once we've put the dash back together, then we can do the power wire at the battery, and yeah, go from there. Actually, forgot, still to join a fuse in. So I'll have to nip that little spade plug up. I'll have to solder my fuses on. So I'll whack the fuse holder in and then put a spade on the terminal on the end of this and then click it into that plug. Yeah, lucky I remembered that. Another little tip for people who are wiring in stuff: if you're wiring in a fuse and it's got power, the best way, if you don't want to disconnect your battery and you can't be bothered, if you leave your fuse out and you have one end joined up, and that's taped up and covered, nothing will arc out. And it's also good to leave your fuse out until you're 100% ready to turn everything on and start it, just in case you've wired something wrong and then you just realise, or if you're not quite ready and you have to strip a wire or something, if you leave the fuse out, power won't get up to your gauge or radio or whatever you're doing. But yeah, there's just a little tip. Alright, so as you just saw, I just soldered in the light wire and also to my fuse holder. So now I'll put the spade terminal on the end of there, plug it into that, put a bit of electrical tape around that one, and whack the dash back in. Alright, what I'm doing at the moment is soldering in the battery power fuse. So I've taken off that fuse wire there. I'm going to try and get it in as best I can. It's not the best joint I've probably made, but yeah, it'll work. And then I'll tape that up with some electrical tape and then run the red wire to the other side of this fuse holder and yeah, finish running the other wires. Yeah, looks like we've got a good solder there, so I can wrap that up with some electrical tape and join this wire to the other end of the fuse. And I'll leave the fuse out, obviously, because I'm not ready to actually get power to the gauge. But yeah, I'll run my other wires, and then when I'm all set up and ready to go, I'll come back to you. Alright, so I've finished running all the wires. There's the red arc gauge just hanging out of the way. Got the wires up into the little holder, which I mounted up. It's just got the double-sided tape, cruddy crap that goes on the bottom there. So yeah, I'm pretty much ready to plug the gauge in and set it up, and I'll put the red arc one back, and then I'll start it up and see what it does. Hopefully all my wiring's good and nothing melts, catches on fire, and the gauge works. So once I've plugged that in and got it set up, I'll show you what I'll just show you starting it up. Alright, I've got both the gauges mounted on the dash, and yeah, ready to start it. Fuses in, wiring's all tidied up, and yeah, moment of truth. Let's hit the key, see what happens. There we go. Beautiful. Even reading. So apparently it's 16 degrees in the exhaust. Feel like it's probably a little bit warmer, but I'm not going to get upset too much. I don't expect this gauge to be to the decimal accurate. Yeah, so now that that's working, I'll have a little fiddle around with the settings and just see what it can do. Set some parameters and just have a bit of a muck around, and then I'll come back to you with what I find and yeah, what I need to do to set it up, and then with the setup of this will be pretty much done. And yeah, it only took me a couple of hours, so that was good. So I'll come back to you in a couple of minutes when I've had a little play around with the gauge and see what it can do. Rightio, I've just been having to play around with the settings on the gauge, set up the colour, which is just green, which is the colour I like to have because the dash sort of lights up green, and that red arc one's set on green as well. You can change the brightness, you can set warnings and all that sort of garbage. As you can with the, so it's pretty much the exact same as this red arc gauge, to be honest with you, just a different look. And it was like $60 as compared to $400. The Red Arc one, the Red Arc one's probably better. It'll probably last longer. Just better quality, I reckon. You never know. This bezel one or bezel might last years. Who knows? But just because it's so cheap, you can never really tell. So yeah, I'll sort of show you what it can do and what I've been mucking around with. I'll also show you the buttons that I've got. So up under here, whoop, there's the horn. I've got the 2 buttons set up. One's for the Red Arc, one's for this other gauge. So basically, it's just to change settings. Where's this button? Probably looks a bit funny on the camera there. It's coming up odd. Yeah, so you can just go through and all different settings. How do we get back to normal? So that's just showing the temperature there now. I have the engine running. It's just 30 degrees. The next setting is just the peak that it's been at. It hasn't been to 200, but that's just the default. You can set your color, so there's all different colors, brightness, the buzzer, sound. That's how loud it is. That's to do with when you start when you turn it off, what it does. So it does that funny little jig there. And when you start it back up, it does that little jig there. That's what that setting's all about. And then go back through. That's where I've got the warning set at 600 degrees, which is the same as the Red Arc one. And then that's another setting you can muck around with, which relates to if the gauge is set up for boost, which this one's not. This is purely just exhaust temperature. So that setting we don't have to muck around with. So as I said, I've got the warning set at 600, same as the Red Arc one, which is probably set. It's set a good point actually. It's probably a little low. I could go to 650 maybe. It does come on every now and then if I'm going up a really steep hill, the wind's at me and it's a hot day, it'll come on. I don't think that warning should come on for that one after the turbo. I don't think it'll get that hot. I could be wrong though. So basically this is all just a big experiment really, putting the second gauge in. Yeah, it's just a big experiment really. I just want to compare those 2 probe positions. As I said earlier, when John redid the engine, we spoke about this and he reckons there's a difference of, he said roughly 200 degrees. Don't take my word for that. We'll do our little experiment tomorrow and find out what it actually is. But I think if it shows up what I think it might show up as, this could be a really interesting video that I'm going to make about it. So yeah, I'll wrap this one up. I'm probably rambling on. Yeah, that's basically how you set up a basic exhaust temp gauge. It's pretty simple, you know, if you've got the tools to do it. Soldering on, a bit of solder, some electrical terminals, a bit of extra wire, and a couple of spare hours on a Sunday or something. Yeah, there are no dramas to wire in. They're pretty simple. Unless you've got to put the fitting on the exhaust, you don't already have that. Then you'd have to weld that or thread it in. I suggest putting it on the manifold. You should put it on the manifold before the turbo instead of after. We'll talk about that in the next video. Yeah, so basic setup on a 79 series, the older style, obviously, with the 6 cylinders. It'll be basically the same for most models. Until you get into your newer V8 ones, that's completely different, and you probably don't really need to do that. I don't even know what sort of gauges they come with, but they might already have exhaust temp gauges. Not sure, don't quote me. So anyway, we'll wrap this video up as usual. Thanks for watching, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the video. We'll catch you to the next one. Ever.